Okay, hi guys. We're going to start our next little lecture here. This one is going to be on militarism and empire in Mesopotamia. So we're going to highlight some of the specific people, places that come to rise in Mesopotamia. The records archaeologically are not great, so definitely when we look at Greece and Rome, we'll be able to look at a lot more individuals than we will in Mesopotamia, but we'll still highlight a few really significant ones today. So hopefully these lectures are working out for you and you don't mind them. I'm going to time myself this time so I don't get cut off again. Whoops. And just follow along with the note as you go, okay? So the question for today is going to be, how did military strength and expansion influence the development of Mesopotamian society? So we're going to look, like I said, at a few different areas. So in general, Mesopotamian cities were founded by the gods. You can see there that the city of Ur had 24,000 people by 3000 BCE, which is pretty significant. A lot of times we tend to think of ancient cities as being small, but certainly 24,000 people is very big. There were constant shifts in power though, so we're never looking at one kind of country that's always unified. We're looking at constant shifts in power. So at one time you have one city that's more important than another city, and you've got those constant rises and falls over the 3,000 years of Mesopotamian history. So we're going to look at four, I think, really big rises and falls throughout that 3,000 years of history. The first one we're going to look at is Sumer and Akkad. So if you look at this map here, you can see that Sumer is in the orange, and the Akkadian Empire, which is the first empire in the world, is in that teal color. So in Sumer, kingship in general for them, the king was said to be the living representation of the gods. So he was sent down by the gods, and then he was kind of worshipped as a god himself. This, of course, will change, and you guys will take a look at religion a little bit more, certainly. His responsibilities as the king were to provide defense, to be the head of the army, to raise and train troops, and he appointed a governor for small towns. So if you watched the Epic of Gilgamesh in the writing lecture, then what you probably noticed was there were certain things about what a king should be, because Gilgamesh was a king, and some of the kingship qualities that Mesopotamians really looked for was to be a good leader, of course, but also to be a really strong warrior king. So that was part of kingship in Sumer. Sumerian armies were very primitive: axes, spears, wheeled chariots, and we'll talk about wheels a little bit more later on. But the Akkadians, it's very easy for them to come down from the north and take over Sumer. Sargon of Akkad, and you can see his dates right there, is actually the first human being ever in kind of the written history of the world to actually create a true empire. He leads a revolt from the north in Akkad to become the king. He attacks city-states towards the south. He actually even invades Egypt and Ethiopia, though isn't able to take them over. But he is the one who creates that first true strong empire in the world. So this is a picture. If you take a look and pause and kind of see what you're looking at here, you can see again some of those kingship qualities. You've got the king up here with a god, obviously showing the importance of kingship being, again, domination and strength. Down here you can probably tell maybe that these are slaves. So again, slavery very important in Mesopotamian society. But again, something that we don't typically see of kingship, at least today, in terms of that domination and that strength. And this is just another symbol of that same ideal of kingship. These are just some typical warrior types. Now, if you read through this, I'm not going to read through the whole thing with you, what you'll see is that Sargon kind of creates this story about himself as a very humble orphan who is a kind of man of the people. He's not a typical royal. You know, he has this story about how his mom was maybe a priestess and then puts him in a basket in the river, which maybe might remind you of the story of Moses, and then gets sent down the river, and then he's kind of brought up on his own. And so it's interesting that as a king, the narrative he tells about himself is this king of very humble origins and beginnings, because he's trying to link himself more to the people rather than link himself to other kings of the smaller city-states. In terms of how the Akkadian, that first big empire, declines, After Sargon of Akkad, you just have some weak rulers, rebellions, revolts. The really big thing here is drought happens, which obviously leaves people very unsettled, very unhappy, which leads to those rebellions and revolts. And because rulers aren't very strong after Sargon, they just can't deal with those revolts in a very good way. Some other reasons are possibly sacrilegious acts of Sargon. So this is kind of one of those legends, the idea that he steals soil from Babylon, and Marduk, who is the major god of Babylon, is super unimpressed about that and so curses Sargon's empire. A lot of bad birth omens surrounding other leaders, but essentially you're looking at that decline. The city-states all still thrive. In the city of Ur, you've got the development of cuneiform mythology, the Epic of Gilgamesh, so you've still got a lot of power within his former empire, but again, you just don't have that united area anymore. So the next rise we'll see is Babylon, and you can see the area there that the first Babylonian Empire takes over. In terms of the Babylonian Empire, and we'll be looking a little bit more at law in Mesopotamia this week, and certainly Hammurabi, this king here, was the first to write a complete law code, certainly not the first written law code ever, but the first kind of complete one. He establishes this Babylonian Empire and keeps the Babylonian Empire in its height between 1792 and 1750 BCE. He has a very strong emphasis on trade, but he is another one of these guys who is just a very strong leader who's able to unite the area. In terms of Hammurabi and who he is as a king, he claims his rule is legitimized by the gods. So unlike Sargon, who claims himself of humble origins and his own individual rise to power, Hammurabi really attributes it to the gods, and the gods putting that on him. Also, he considers himself to be a provider for the people. So he tries really hard, and records show, though again, there's not tons and tons of records, but records do show that he does seem to be sincere about trying to improve life for people. People call him the kind of builder of the land. So even though he's on campaign a lot, he actually tries to improve life within Mesopotamia. Certainly law and social justice is a big focus for him trying to create some sort of equality within the citizens, probably not the equality that we think of today, but a very ancient sort of form of equality that's very different again than other leaders at the time. He builds canals, he works on food distribution, beautification of the city, making things look nice, lots of different building projects, and he establishes relative peace within the Mesopotamian Empire. So he's seen as a really good diplomat, negotiator, basically a really good, strong king. In terms of how the Babylonian Empire declines, again, you've got weak rulers who can't really hold the empire together. You also have waves of invaders, the Hittites and the Kassites, who come in, and because leadership isn't really strong, it's really easy for them to then take over the area. So the next, and this is maybe one of the more interesting empires because it does stand out very different than the ones that we've talked about already, is the Assyrian Empire. And you can see there the three different colors of green in terms of the time periods and how much land they are able to take over. Sorry guys, I'm sick. Sorry for the sniffing. So the Assyrian Empire that we're looking at is between 11,000 and 600 BCE, becomes a very major economic and political powerhouse, got major trading centers in Assyria, and you've got with the Assyrians kind of a mix of Sumerian and Babylonian cultures. So they don't have their own kind of set way of doing things. They sort of take things from other people and mix them together. There is here, though, a very clear separation of religion and state. So this is the more traditional form of Mesopotamian leadership, where kings get their power from the gods, but they aren't gods themselves. They just kind of act as representatives of the gods on land. And temples during this time, interestingly, are built for kings rather than for gods. And again, we'll be looking at religion and temples and those kind of things in a little bit. Now, the interesting thing about the Assyrian Empire is that they are very warlike people under very strong warrior kings. There are lots of records of atrocities committed against their citizens. They were very cruel to their enemies. There were reports of torturing, killing prisoners of war, and they created very strong professional armies. So they were very specialized in combat. And what we're going to look at is I'm going to pull up a few primary sources. I'm not going to read each one. You might want to kind of pause and read yourself just so that we can save on time. But there are some very interesting primary source records of what these kings were said to have done to their conquerors. Sorry, to the lands that they conquered. They were said to have no mercy. So things like, I cut off their heads, and like heaps of grain, I piled them up. I skinned alive all their chief men, their young men and maidens I burned in the fire. If you take a look at this relief, and this is a drawing taken from one of those stone reliefs in Mesopotamia, you can see like, oh, it looks really nice, chariots and royals. But if you take a closer look, you'll see they're kind of carrying around and tossing heads of the conquered peoples. So again, very warlike, no mercy kind of people. So I'm not going to read each one of these, but you might want to pause and read them yourself because they are very interesting in terms of showing just how brutal they were, talking about erecting stakes and talking about, in very poetic language actually, talking about burning adolescent boys and girls, carrying off the captives, dyeing mountains red with blood. And then this one's always a fun one, especially towards the end there. Their testicles I cut off and tore out their privates like the seeds of cucumbers. So you've got very brutal leadership here in the Assyrian Empire that you don't see in the other Mesopotamian empires. So again, hopefully you paused those and read through them because they are very crazy and interesting. You've got a lot of good warrior kings in the Assyrian Empire. Ashurbanipal is the one that you should remember. He creates the largest empire ever known at the time. He divides his empire into provinces to make it easier to govern, and he is, like we just saw, considered to be a very cruel king in terms of the territories that he takes over. At the same time, he does have a very big palace, massive garden, a zoo, a library of clay tablets. So there's an interest there in intellectual pursuits, but certainly it's more of a collection of intellectual pursuits rather than him focusing on his empire, pursuing those things on their own. In terms of decline, it was a very large empire at the time, very hard to keep together, lots of attacks on the borders, and overthrows by foreigners. So the last big swell that we'll see is kind of Babylon 2.0. You'll also see it referred to as Chaldea. So this is where Babylon again becomes the most important city-state with Marduk. Nebuchadnezzar II is the name you should remember. Biblical Nebuchadnezzar II is known for the Babylonian exile of the Jews, and we see him as sort of in the Bible at least, an enemy of the god. Now, in terms of what we're looking at, as the king, he makes this plea to Marduk saying, you know, that he wants to endure forever, create a place that's going to endure forever and for all mankind. He actually spends a lot making the city great, and those blue walls there are, I think they're in the British Museum right now, but those are the gates of Ishtar, and they were said to be very thick, and he used slave labor to create them, and they were so thick that you could have chariot races along the top. He also creates the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, which is one of the 7 ancient wonders of the world, though probably not exactly what people say that it was. Nebuchadnezzar, unlike Ashurbanipal, actually creates a center for arts and intellectual pursuits, though. So women get kind of equal rights. You have the increase in literacy in schools and temples. Math and science starts to flourish. So he is not a warlike king. The Babylonian Empire, the second time around, is much more about intellect and art and protecting its empire, but not so much about going out and expanding the empire. And this is just a picture of those Hanging Gardens of Babylon, which is said to be sort of this big wonder because you had these gardens on top of this ziggurat that that were irrigated supposedly through pumps that brought the water up, which is interesting and crazy. So who knows if it was really true. In terms of the decline, again, you've got foreigners aligning with powerful Persians and kind of the absorption into the Persian Empire, which we'll look at a little bit more when we look at Greece. So those are the rises and falls that we typically look at with ancient Mesopotamia, four kind of major names to look at and remember there. So yeah, hopefully this helped you out a little bit in terms of me being able to narrate through some of this Prezi rather than you just having to read it on your own. Okay, thanks guys.